Uh, there are moments in a nation's story when the shadows say more about us than the light ever could. When the things we trust without question, the institutions we assume are steady, disciplined, unshakable, suddenly reveal the fractures beneath their polished surface. And if we're honest with ourselves, we don't always want to look at those fractures. We'd rather believe that the people who stand closest to power are somehow immune from the same temptations and mistakes that tug at the rest of us. Most people overlook this, but proximity to the presidency has a way of magnifying everything: the duty, the fear, the pressure, and yes, the darkness too. And so when we talk about the Secret Service, that quiet ring of men and women who have walked presidents through chaos and toward hope, we're not really talking about an agency. We're talking about a mirror held up to the best and worst of who we are, a mirror that's been cracked and mended more times than the public ever sees. Because if we trace the story back, if we sit with it long enough to feel the weight of what's at stake, we start to notice something sobering. Every lapse, every scandal, every heroic split-second decision tells us something about the fragile project of democracy itself and the human beings we task with protecting it. And I've found myself thinking about this more than I'd like to admit, about how a system built to shield the presidency can still stumble under the weight of its own imperfections, about how John F. Kennedy rode through Dallas on that November day in 1963, believing, perhaps like so many Americans did, that a nation moving forward could outrun its own divisions. And then, in a flash, that belief was pierced by a rifle from a warehouse window. A failure not just of coordination, but of imagination, the inability to see the full extent of the threat until it was too late. A failure that would haunt the service for generations, even as it rebuilt itself with trembling hands and a silent vow, never again. But history has a way of testing our promises, and sometimes it tests them in ways that reveal just how human even our guardians are. I think about the 1972 scandal agents supposed to be preparing for Nixon's trip to China, instead tangled up in a Florida night they should have walked away from. You don't need a headline to understand the danger in that. The danger isn't just misconduct, it's what misconduct signals to the country. That even the people watching the perimeter can lose sight of the mission. That power, when left unchecked, whispers temptations that can chip away at dignity and discipline one careless moment at a time. And as I reflect on all this, I keep coming back to a single question, the kind that I saw it in the quiet professionalism of the agents who guarded my daughters, men and women who carried the weight of responsibility with a seriousness that still humbles me. They weren't just protecting the children of a president, they were protecting the childhoods of two young girls who didn't ask for the spotlight but lived in it. And every time I watched those agents scan a room, reposition their bodies, anticipate threats no one else noticed, I was reminded of the extraordinary demands we place on ordinary people. But extraordinary demands require extraordinary support. And when that support collapses, so does the mission. What happened in Butler didn't begin in Butler. It began years earlier, in the budget meetings where requested resources were cut, in the transition periods where institutional memory was lost, in the cultural fractures that widened as politics became more toxic, and the job became more dangerous, more thankless, more volatile. You cannot separate the health of the Secret Service from the health of the nation it serves. When America becomes more polarized, threats multiply. When public discourse grows venomous, extremists feel emboldened, and in that kind of climate, the margin for error already razor thin shrinks to almost nothing. This is the part people forget. Protecting a president is not just a security task, it's a moral enterprise. It requires agents who believe in something larger than themselves. Agents who understand that they aren't guarding a man or a woman, they're guarding the very idea of continuity. They're guarding the belief that leadership, even when flawed, must remain stable, must remain safe, must remain intact for democracy to function. And that belief is strained when the institution shows cracks. When scandals erupt, whether in foreign hotel rooms or American conference rooms, they don't just embarrass the agency, they erode the public's trust. They cast shadows on the thousands of agents who serve with integrity every day. And they give ammunition to those who insist that government, in all its forms, is irredeemably broken. But institutions don't redeem themselves through denial. They redeem themselves through transformation. The question the Secret Service must confront now is the same question every major institution faces when confronted with its own failures. Will it choose to evolve, or will whether the people inside the institution and the people charged with overseeing it will choose the hard path of reform over the easy comfort of denial? Whether we understand that accountability is not a punishment, but a path toward progress, whether we are willing to confront not just the failures we've seen on the news, but the quiet failures hidden in unspoken rooms. Because those hidden failures are the ones that grow. Those are the ones that linger. Those are the ones that shape culture in ways that explode later. And if we want to protect the presidency, if we want to protect the republic, then we must be willing to do something harder than pointing fingers. We must be willing to change. And change, real change, rarely announces itself with fanfare. It doesn't arrive in a neat binder or a polished memo. More often, it begins as a quiet shift in mindset, a conversation that's a little more honest than the one before it, an admission that the old ways aren't sufficient, a recognition that the next crisis won't wait for the institution to feel ready. It begins in the space where vulnerability meets responsibility. Because protection isn't just about strength, it's about awareness. It's about understanding that the shield you hold is only as sturdy as the truth you're willing to confront. It's about recognizing that an institution designed to save lives must itself be willing to evolve in order to prevent the loss of more lives. And evolution requires facing the very human instinct to look away. There's a temptation, sometimes subtle, sometimes overwhelming, to avoid calling out the cracks that form under pressure. People fear reprisal. They fear embarrassment. They fear being seen as disloyal or difficult. And so they stay silent. They hope the problem resolves itself. They convince themselves that maybe it's not as bad as it seems. But hope is not a strategy. Silence is not a shield. And the cost of ignoring a flaw in a protection detail is far too high to gamble on comfort. So the real challenge isn't just technical. It's moral. It requires asking people to act against the instinct that says, stay quiet, stay safe. It requires leaders to reward truth even when that truth is painful. It requires building a culture where raising a concern is viewed not as disloyalty, but as a deeper form of service. Because every institution, whether it admits it or not, is shaped by what it encourages people to speak about and what it pressures them to hide. And when the unspoken becomes dangerous, the consequences become national. That's why the story of the Secret Service's struggles isn't a story about incompetence. It's a story about humanity. It's a story about how even the most disciplined organizations can drift when the demands placed upon them grow faster than their capacity to adapt. It's a story about leadership that must learn, and frontline guardians who must be empowered to lead from below. It's a story about the tension between secrecy and safety. You choose what you honor with your focus. You choose the mental diet you consume. You choose whether you live consciously or whether you live on autopilot. And every day, every hour, you get another chance to make that choice again. That is the real frontier. Not artificial intelligence, but attentional intelligence, the ability to discipline your awareness in a world determined to dilute it. And if we can master that, then no matter how advanced the technology becomes, our humanity will remain sovereign. Sometimes I think back to those mornings in the Oval Office, long before the sun came up, when the building was still, and the only sound was the faint hum of the air vents pushing warm air through old walls. Those were the moments when I felt the full weight and clarity of attention, because when you're sitting behind that desk, you're not surrounded by peace. You're surrounded by pressure, endless briefings, a world full of crises, millions of people counting on you, opponents waiting for you to slip, allies hoping you'll hold steady. And yet, in that silence, you realize something important. Noise isn't what surrounds you. Noise is what you allow in. There were days when threats were escalating overseas, or when another mass shooting shook the country, or when the intelligence briefings painted a future as uncertain as the present. And I'd have senior advisors, military generals, lawmakers, all offering competing arguments about what to do next. But before I listened to any of them, I had to listen to myself. Because If I let the noise lead, if I let the loudest voice dictate the direction, I'd lose the clarity necessary to make decisions that affected not just policy, but people's lives. And I'll tell you something else, attention in leadership is not about focusing on everything. It's about focusing on the right things. When you walk into that building, the West Wing, it becomes clear very quickly that the urgent will always try to suffocate the important. Emails, headlines, breaking news, political storms. But the problems that require depth, empathy, patience, they reveal themselves only when you slow down enough to notice them. That's true for a president. It's true for a parent. It's true for a student trying to figure out their future. It's true for anyone trying to build a meaningful life. And as the years went on, I saw more and more how technology was accelerating that shift, shortening attention spans, fragmenting public discourse, rewarding outrage over understanding. Even inside the White House, we weren't immune to it. There were days when entire teams would walk, and that's how people wake up one day, whether they're 20 or 50, and realize they've been drifting through a life they never consciously designed. So maybe the question isn't just how AI is changing us. Maybe the question is what we're allowing it to change and what we're willing to protect. Our attention, our discernment, our humanity, because that's the part no machine can replicate unless we hand it over. And the truth is, we often hand over pieces of ourselves without even noticing. A few minutes here, a distracted conversation there, a moment when we choose convenience over curiosity. But the good news, and I believe this, is that the same small choices that lead us away from ourselves can also lead us back. All it takes is awareness. All it takes is one moment of pause. All it takes is deciding that your mind is a place worth respecting. And when you begin to reclaim that attention, you start noticing things you missed before. You notice the subtle ways people communicate. You notice the gaps between what is said and what is meant. You notice patterns, connections, and truths that were previously invisible under the constant hum of distraction. It's like walking through a fog that suddenly begins to lift. Everything that was blurry comes into focus. The choices you thought were inevitable suddenly appear as options. The paths you assumed were blocked now seem navigable. And that clarity is transformative, not just for you, but for everyone around you. Because once you can focus, you can listen. Once you can listen, you can understand. Once you can understand, you can act with intention rather than impulse. I think about this in the context of our democracy too. We often talk about technology as a neutral tool, but it's not neutral if it captures the very faculty that allows citizens to engage thoughtfully, to deliberate, to question, to participate fully. A distracted citizen is less likely to vote, less likely to debate, less likely to confront injustice, less likely to see the humanity in those who disagree with them. And that erosion, subtle as it may be, accumulates over time. The fabric of civic life frays when attention is habitually diverted, and the institutions we rely on, courts, legislatures, law enforcement,